Every day, thousands of tourists pour through the Meridian Gate of the Forbidden City in Beijing, their cameras ready to capture the heart of the old empire. And almost every day, tour guides face the exact same request. Show us the Cold Palace. People expect a dungeon. They want to see damp stone walls, heavy iron bars, and the miserable cell blocks where Chinese emperors locked away their disgraced wives. The guides usually just smile, shake their heads, and point to the official map of the museum. There is no Cold Palace on it. Asia's most terrifying prison had no address or perimeter fence. It didn't even have a dedicated building. The Cold Palace, or Leng Gong in Chinese, wasn't a place you were sent to. It was a status that came to you. Any luxurious silk-lined bedroom in the Imperial complex could become a black site the moment the emperor uttered a single word. To understand how a palace turns into a tomb without moving a single brick, you have to look at the blueprints. The Forbidden City was engineered as a flawless machine of control. We are talking about a rectangular fortress stretching 961 meters from north to south and 753 meters from east to west, wrapped in defensive walls 8 meters high. The entire complex was sharply divided into two distinct worlds. The outer court, with its massive sweeping courtyards, was the stage for state ceremony and male officials. The inner court, hidden behind further walls, was the strict domain of the emperor's women and the eunuchs who managed them. By design, the inner court was already a secure facility. The last emperor, Puyi, wrote extensively in his memoirs about growing up inside this enclosure. He described a world of staggering visual luxury that functioned as an absolute cage, where every step was dictated by rigid etiquette, and stepping outside the gates was a rare traumatic event. For the women of the harem, the isolation was total. Imperial ideology claimed the complex contained 9,999 rooms, just one less than the heavenly palace of the Jade Emperor. That is an almost infinite expanse of architecture. Yet, for a woman who fell out of favor, that vast universe instantly collapsed down to the four walls of her current residence. The term Leng Gong appears frequently in classical texts and court records, but architectural historians generally agree it was rarely a fixed coordinate. Sometimes, women were quietly relocated to the neglected draftingly pavilions in the far northwest or northeast corners of the inner court. These were the areas with less ornate woodwork, far removed from the emperor's central axis, where low-ranking concubines and forgotten widows lived out their decades. But more often, a woman simply stayed exactly where she was. The transformation from an honored consort to a prisoner of the Cold Palace was purely administrative. The heavy wooden doors to her courtyard were simply shut and boarded up, leaving perhaps a small gap near the floor. Yesterday, she was an active player in court politics, surrounded by serving maids and burning premium smokeless charcoal. Today, she is sealed inside the same room. The visitors vanish, and the eunuchs slide leftover scraps through the floor gap. This was a system optimized for psychological erasure. The court despised bloody public executions for its high-ranking women. Execution was messy. It provoked family clans and ruined the aesthetic harmony of the dynasty. Quiet fading was the preferred protocol. Once designated as living in the cold, a woman suffered a total social death. She was stripped of audiences. Her family inside the palace was forbidden to visit. Even her name was slowly scrubbed from the daily reality of the court. Imperial records rarely used personal names anyway, referring to women only by their titles and ranks. When the title lost its power, the woman effectively ceased to exist in the public discourse. The design of the inner court amplified this torment. The maze of red walls and heavy gates created a deliberate spatial illusion. A concubine felt she was living inside an endless, bustling city. But her actual daily route was restricted to a few interconnected courtyards. The rest of the palace was just rumors and glimpses of yellow-glazed roofs in the distance. When the heavy doors locked, even the rumors stopped. But the true horror of the Leng Gong wasn't architectural. It was accounting. A woman could technically keep her official rank on paper. She remained a consort, officially recognized by the state. But the imperial supply chain simply amputated her from the ledger. The harem ran on an obsessive spreadsheet of allocations. Your exact rank dictated your daily grams of pork and the precise number of wax candles you were allowed to burn. An order sending a woman to the cold palace was essentially a memo to the financial department. They stopped the supplies. The physical body was kept on the empire's balance sheet, but the fuel to keep it warm was cut off. It was an economic assassination executed by accountants and eunuchs. This mechanism of quiet, invisible erasure worked flawlessly for centuries. It relied on the victims going mad in the silence or quietly succumbing to the brutal Beijing winters. Then, in the late 19th century, a woman named Consort Zhen entered the Forbidden City. Known historically as the Pearl Concubine, she was the Guangxu Emperor's favorite, and she categorically refused to play by the rules of the fading ghost. Consort Zhen was unapologetically stubborn. She was fascinated by the encroaching Western world, buying a camera to take photographs inside the sacred precincts. She even wore men's clothing to move around more freely. Most dangerously, she openly supported the emperor's radical political reforms, putting her on a direct collision course with the true power in the palace. Empress Dowager Cixi. Cixi utilized the cold palace system just as ruthlessly as any emperor before her. When Consort Zhen crossed the line, she was stripped of her privileges and physically beaten before being locked away in the small Jingqi pavilion in the northeastern section of the palace. For 3 years, she sat in the cold. But unlike the thousands of women who had quietly withered away in similar rooms, Consort Zhen did not break. She remained a vocal, political liability. In the summer of 1900, as the Boxer Rebellion tore through Beijing and an alliance of foreign armies breached the city gates, the imperial court prepared to flee. The protocol of the invisible prison had finally reached its limit. The system could not simply leave a defiant pro-Western consort behind to potentially negotiate with the occupying forces. The silent erasure wasn't enough. According to widespread accounts and late imperial rumors, Cixi summoned the battered concubine one last time. There was no administrative memo. Legend claims Cixi gave a direct, brutal order to her eunuchs. Drown her first, then we can leave. Consort Zhen was shoved down a small water well behind the Ningxu Palace. After hundreds of years of maintaining the illusion of a bloodless bureaucratic prison, the empire was forced to perform a dirty physical execution. The invisible cage had required a very real, very vertical grave. Every gram of pork, every ounce of tea, and every stick of firewood consumed behind the high red walls was tracked by the Neiwufu, the Imperial Household Department. This massive bureaucratic apparatus was staffed by thousands of bondservants who maintained the grand ledgers of existence. They managed the Imperial Harem as a mega-corporation, governed by strict procurement quotas. Just beneath the Empress, the elite tier, the noble consort, the pure consort, the virtuous consort, and the wise consort were classified as first-rank officials in the broader state hierarchy. This legal standing automatically bound their biological presence to immense daily allotments. The Qing emperors were obsessed with fiscal discipline, desperate to avoid the mistakes of the previous Ming Dynasty, which had maintained sprawling, hyper-expensive harems that drained the national treasury. The Qing response was to turn the inner court into a masterpiece of standardized survival. They capped the number of high-ranking wives and quantified everyone else. The spreadsheet had a long, brutal tail. Drop below the formalized consort ranks, and the numerical limits on women vanished. The emperor could theoretically stockpile an infinite number of noble ladies, constant attendants, and basic attendants. For these women, the grand imperial dream collapsed into a micromanaged poverty. A low-tier attendant was allocated barely 5 pounds of meat a day. That single ration was not just for her plate. It was meant to feed her mandatory serving staff as well. Once the maids and eunuchs took their necessary portions, the woman at the center of the arrangement might be left with little more than vegetable broth and the toughest cuts of gristle. The records highlight a bizarre contradiction. Legally, these young women were esteemed members of the ruling family, bound by suffocating protocol. Economically, their daily material allowance was often smaller than that of a low-level provincial clerk who would never even see the capital. Upward mobility in this environment required a biological miracle. Delivering a male heir to the emperor functioned as an instant, massive budget expansion. A new prince meant a new ledger page. The moment a child was born, a consort's allowances for meat, silk, and fuel could double overnight. A child was dynastic capital and the only reliable mechanism to increase your personal wealth inside a closed economy. The system kept the women rich in physical goods, but starved of actual currency. The empress received mountains of luxury fabrics, but handled very little hard cash. A handful of lower-ranked women sometimes received minor silver stipends they could actually spend, though they lacked the political weight to make that money matter. The financial ledgers were incredibly granular, tracking not just daily survival, but seasonal dignity. During major festivals, the Wufu distributed celebratory offerings. The women occupying the bottom rows of the ledger received the exact same categories of gifts as the empress, but in quantities so microscopically small, it felt like an administrative insult. It was a mathematical reminder of their exact place in the pecking order. The most critical column on that ledger was the winter fuel. The reduction of fuel quotas followed the same bureaucratic logic. For the accountants, it was just another line crossed out in red ink. Once the official supply lines were cut, the isolated woman was thrown completely at the mercy of the delivery network. The eunuchs operated as the absolute monopolists of access to the outside world. They carried the trays, unlocked the courtyard gates, and managed the daily distribution of whatever meager scraps the Wufu still authorized. For these men, the sudden financial ruin of a consort offered a rare opportunity for class revenge. A young woman who had previously treated them as invisible furniture was now begging them for a cup of hot water. The eunuchs didn't even need to physically abuse her. They just had to follow the new budget to the letter. They could weaponize the daily routine, leaving a hot bowl of rice to sit in the freezing courtyard for an hour before handing it over. In the shadow of the official spreadsheet, a desperate black market emerged. Late imperial rumors and courtyard gossip suggest that some demoted consorts tried to bribe clerks and eunuchs with smuggled silver or hidden jewelry just to subtly alter the ledger digits. They were trying to buy back a few extra pounds of meat or a bucket of lower-grade coal. The price for a smuggled letter or a single sip of clean water could drain a lifetime of savings in weeks. If the bribes ran out, the erasure proceeded as designed. The accounting department simply watched the inventory shrink. The actual transfer into the status of a ghost rarely involved dramatic violence. The process was swift, and the methodology was purely technical. The woman simply stayed in her room, or was quietly relocated to a remote northern pavilion, and the eunuch maintenance crew arrived with heavy wooden plank. They boarded up the intricate lattice windows, sealing off the light, the view of the sky, and the flow of air. The main double doors were chained and nailed shut from the outside, the sharp clatter of the iron hammers echoing across the courtyard as the final seal was set. They left exactly one modification: a small, rough-hewn slot carved at the very base of the door, just above the stone threshold. From that exact moment, the physics of the space changed entirely. The Forbidden City, for all its golden roofs and imperial grandeur, sits directly in the path of the Siberian anticyclone. Beijing winters are utterly devoid of soft, snowy romance. The climate is notoriously dry, aggressively windy, and bitterly cold. Average daytime temperatures in December and January hover just above freezing, but when the northern winds sweep down from the Mongolian steppes, the nights routinely plunge to -15 degrees Celsius. The wind chill factor transforms the moving air into a physical blade that cuts through silk and skin alike. The architecture of the inner court was completely unequipped to handle this naturally. The imperial pavilions were highly decorated stone and wood tents, designed primarily to capture summer breezes. They featured extremely high ceilings, thin brick walls, and massive open corridors that functioned like wind tunnels. To survive January in those chambers, a high-ranking consort relied on a massive daily supply of premium, smokeless black charcoal. This specific fuel, issued strictly by the pound according to the accounting ledgers, was burned in large bronze braziers, heating both the ambient air and the hollow brick kang platforms where the women slept. The fire was the only barrier between the delicate life of the court and the lethal winter outside. But the bureaucratic edict of demotion wiped the coal quota to zero. The heavy bronze braziers were left empty and cold. The fires inside the kang were systematically extinguished. Within 24 hours, the ambient temperature inside the sealed room equalized with the frozen courtyard. The architectural elegance of the pavilion now worked against its occupant, trapping the cold in the high rafters and amplifying the drafts through the floorboards. Imagine standing perfectly still in a stone-floored, unheated warehouse in the dead of January, wearing nothing but the layered autumn silk you happened to have on when the lock clicked. You are not allowed winter coats. Heavy furs, sable linings, and quilted cloaks were requisitioned properties of the Imperial Household Department, assigned strictly by active rank. When the rank vanished from the ledger, so did the insulation. Liquidation of personal assets became the next inevitable stage of this financial agony. Locked in her courtyard and cut off from state supplies, the woman was forced to consume her own capital. Luxurious gifts received during periods of imperial favor, pearl hairpins, jade-inlaid combs, untouched bolts of heavy Sichuan silk rapidly lost their ceremonial value, turning into primitive currency for survival. Here, the eunuchs of the serving staff reinvented themselves as shadow brokers. Taking jewelry from the isolated courtyard, they carried it through the northern Shenwu Gate to sell in the capital's pawn shops. The exchange rate in this closed economy was predatory. A kingfisher feather hairpin, worth 50 taels of silver on the streets of Beijing, was exchanged by a eunuch inside the palace for a sack of low-grade charcoal or a basket of rotting vegetables. The Niwufu, whose spy network penetrated the entire Forbidden City, knew perfectly well about this black market, but tacitly encouraged it. By allowing eunuchs to plunder and profit from disgraced women, the court department solved the problem of its low-level staff's poor wages without spending a single copper coin from the state treasury. It was an ideal closed cycle of corruption built into the official economic model. Imperial property returned through the back door to the city markets, paying for the slow death of a former favorite. But the deconstruction of status was not limited to the perimeter of the palace walls. In Qing China, a concubine was not just a woman. She represented a high-risk investment project of an entire clan. Families spent years preparing daughters for selection, going deeply into debt to bribe officials, pay etiquette tutors, and assemble a lavish dowry. A successful career for the daughter in the harem meant access to state contracts, tax breaks, and lucrative posts for brothers and uncles. Therefore, the bureaucratic erasure of a concubine inside the palace immediately triggered a corporate default of her family on the periphery. The accounting of punishment worked in synchrony. As soon as a woman's name was struck from the ration lists, Neiwufu couriers rode to the provinces with confiscation warrants. Chaojia. Family mansions were sealed, fertile lands were confiscated in favor of the imperial court, and male relatives were stripped of their posts and sent into exile. The court department kept detailed inventories of the confiscated goods, from antique vases in the father's parlor to the last copper basin in the kitchen. Thus, the fall of one woman turned into a profitable financial operation for the empire, expropriating the wealth accumulated by the clan. The state always came out ahead. An even more cynical mechanism of financial pressure was the system of internal fines. Palace life required the use of state property, and any damage to it incurred financial liability. If a servant girl broke a porcelain cup from the imperial service or accidentally burned a hole in a carpet, the cost of the damage was deducted from the concubine's allowance. While the woman was in favor and receiving a high stipend, these deductions were unnoticeable. But for an isolated prisoner with a slashed budget, any broken teapot turned into an insurmountable debt. Archives have preserved documents absurd in their cruelty. Disgraced women locked in empty, icy rooms were officially listed as debtors to the imperial treasury for damage to state property from years earlier. This debt could exceed their remaining payments, pushing their personal balance deep into the negative. When isolation, hunger, or illness finally led to physical death, the end of this drama was also framed not as a human tragedy, but as the closing of an accounting entry. Quarterly inspectors entered the emptied courtyard not to mourn the deceased, but to conduct a total inventory. The Neiwufu accountants could cross out a name with red ink, but they never hammered a nail over a doorway or stood guard outside a frozen courtyard. The bureaucratic erasure only worked because it was handed down to a completely different class of people for physical enforcement. Here is the sharpest irony of the Forbidden City. The exact moment a high-ranking aristocratic woman lost her official status, Her survival fell entirely into the hands of the very men the imperial system classified as subhuman. The social pyramid simply flipped upside down, handing the lowest caste absolute dominion over the fallen elite. To understand the daily reality of this isolation, you have to look at the men holding the keys. The eunuchs of the late Qing Dynasty were largely drawn from the empire's most desperate margins. They were the sons of impoverished farmers, orphans, or the children of criminals forced into a brutal physical mutilation for the sole purpose of securing a steady meal. The imperial treasury valued their sacrifice at an average starting salary of roughly 2 to 4 taels of silver per month. Even the absolute upper echelon of the service capped out at around 12 taels. This was a starvation wage, and everyone within the high walls knew it. The meager official pay essentially legalized systemic extortion, forcing the palace staff to build an immense shadow economy just to survive. These men lived in cramped quarters known as menials' houses, tightly packed structures that clung to the sides of the main palaces and grand courtyard. These clustered barracks formed a dense, invisible infrastructure around the emperor's center. The eunuchs controlled the geography of the inner court entirely. They held the heavy warded locks, managed the delivery schedules, and monitored every physical threshold. As her official supplies were cut off under the protocol of bureaucratic erasure, the eunuchs stationed outside her pavilion instantly became her biological filter. They were the absolute monopolists of the outside world, controlling everything from the flow of oxygen and information to the arrival of daily rations. The emperors were deeply aware of this terrifying bottleneck. Official edicts and massive iron steles erected within the palace grounds constantly threatened the eunuch population with unimaginable violence. The engraved laws promised the punishment of Ling Qi, death by 1,000 cuts, for any servant caught meddling in politics, taking bribes, or colluding with outside officials. For lesser crimes of theft involving imperial property, the standard procedure was exile to Manchuria or a swift beheading at a public execution ground in the city. The existence of these heavy iron warnings proves the exact opposite of their intent. The court had to carve the threats into solid metal precisely because the institutional control was failing and the shadow power of the eunuch network was overwhelming the daily operations of the harem. This financial bleeding was accompanied by a vicious psychological warfare. For the eunuchs, the downfall of a prominent consort offered a rare, sanctioned opportunity for class revenge. A few weeks prior, this same woman might have been a first-rank favorite, draped in silk, demanding absolute silence and treating the palace staff as invisible furniture. Now she was officially a ghost, begging a castrated peasant for a cup of hot water. The guards didn't need to risk the executioner's blade by physically striking her. They simply enforced her new poverty with malicious precision. The torment was baked into the daily routine. A guard might accidentally kick up courtyard dust into her meager vegetable ration just before sliding the tray under the boards. He could enforce complete sensory deprivation by refusing to speak a single word to her for months, ignoring her pleas through the heavy wood. He might conveniently forget to empty the chamber pot left in the narrow gap, letting the foul air fill the sealed, unventilated room for days. The deeper the ruling elite retreated into their paranoid isolation, the more they surrendered the actual physical mechanics of power to the lowest levels of the service staff. The eunuchs became the ultimate, unquestioned managers of human misery. They were introduced into the system as safe, sterile guardians, stripped of the ability to father a rival dynasty. Cut off from normal family lines and completely dependent on the palace for their survival, they attached themselves fiercely to the strongest power centers within the walls. This made them dangerous to the weak, but incredibly useful to the strong. They were men conditioned by a lifetime of systemic abuse, trained to view the harem women not as untouchable goddesses, but as volatile commodities whose value could drop to zero overnight. This conditioned cruelty turned the eunuch network into the perfect instrument for the throne's darkest impulses. When an apex predator of the inner court decided that a troublesome woman needed to experience more than just a bureaucratic demotion, they didn't call upon the Imperial Guard. The military had a code, a chain of command, and external loyalties. The ruling elite instead relied on the menials who already held the keys to the dark rooms, the men who had spent their entire lives mastering the art of silent, deniable torment. They were the ultimate biological weapons of the empire, waiting in the shadows of the courtyards, perfectly prepared to execute any command without hesitation or mercy. The human body reacts to this kind of chronic, moderate hypothermia with agonizing predictability. The violent shivering starts within hours. It is a desperate physiological attempt to generate heat, burning rapidly through whatever caloric reserves remain in the tissues. Then the peripheral blood vessels violently constrict to protect the core organs. Fingers and toes go entirely numb, turning a pale, waxy yellow as the blood is pulled away. Moving becomes intensely painful as the synovial fluid in the joints thickens from the cold. The humidity of a woman's own terrified breath condenses on the freezing wooden walls, creating a thin, creeping layer of white frost inside the darkness of the room. When thirst became unbearable and the eunuchs conveniently forgot the water ration, that wall frost became the only source of hydration. To maintain internal heat against a sustained sub-zero environment, the body demands massive amounts of energy. But the food quota was gone. What came through that floor slot was whatever the eunuch detail decided to push through it. Usually, it was the congealed, rotting leftovers scraped from the plates of the lower servants, a slurry of rice and vegetable stalks. A bowl would be deliberately left out in the biting wind until it was a block of ice before being shoved roughly through the gap. The woman inside had to drop to her knees on the freezing stone to retrieve it. She ate with her fingers in the pitch black. This severe caloric starvation accelerated the physical collapse. Without enough fat or protein to fuel the metabolic furnace, the immune system simply shut down. The skin cracked and bled, refusing to heal. The joints swelled into heavy, aching knots. Every breath of the dry, icy air irritated the lungs, leading to a deep, rattling chronic bronchitis that echoed hollowly off the boarded-up walls. That coughing was the only sound she would make, and it was entirely her own problem. The Imperial Medical Bureau also followed the spreadsheet of official status. A doctor would not cross the threshold to treat an erased person. She could develop severe pneumonia. She could break a bone falling on the ice-slicked floor. She could bleed internally from scurvy. She remained biologically invisible to the Empire's medical staff. The records would show no pulse taken, no ginseng prescriptions written, no visits logged. She was already legally dead. Her body just hadn't caught up yet. Yet the physical deterioration was only the baseline. The true, calculated horror of the Leng Gong protocol was its mastery of sensory deprivation. With the windows boarded and the allowance for beeswax candles revoked, the room was plunged into darkness. Day and night blurred into a continuous, freezing twilight. The entire visual world shrank to the narrow, dusty beam of light creeping through the food slot at the bottom of the door. When I review the modern psychiatric studies on prolonged solitary confinement, the timeline for this exact scenario becomes devastatingly clear. Without external stimuli, without the rhythm of the sun, and without a single human conversation, the human brain begins to misfire. Within weeks, the sheer lack of sensory input forces the mind to manufacture its own. The profound silence of a locked courtyard in the forbidden zones is a heavy, suffocating pressure. It is the kind of quiet where the sound of your own heartbeat becomes a physical thud in your ears, and the scuff of a rat's claw on the tile sounds like a heavy boot on the stones. Deprived of social interaction, the isolated women inevitably began to experience acute paranoia and auditory hallucinations. They heard whispers leaking through the wood. They saw movement in the pitch-black corners where the frost gathered. The Chinese historical anecdotes are filled with the trope of the mad woman in the forgotten wing, screaming at ghosts and tearing at her own clothes. This was not a poetic tragedy or a dramatic literary device. It was a biologically guaranteed outcome of the isolation protocol. The system was meticulously engineered to shatter the mind long before the freezing temperatures stopped the heart. The profound cruelty lay in the duration. Execution by poison or a silk cord was a sudden, violent severance. The cold palace was a slow-motion erasure that could stretch for decades. Rumors, sometimes whispered by the eunuchs who outlived the dynasty, spoke of women who survived in these conditions for 30 or 40 years. They became entirely feral, crawling on the stone, having forgotten language entirely, reduced to purely animal reactions to the opening of the food slot. When an emperor finally died and the inner courts were reorganized, the new administration would occasionally pry open a door that hadn't been unsealed since the previous reign. They would find a hollow-eyed, emaciated creature completely divorced from reality. The process was a flawless, self-sustaining machine of psychological destruction that no one survived with their sanity intact, except for the Pearl Concubine. While the physics of nowhere were designed to reduce any aristocrat to a weeping, hallucinating wreck within a matter of months, Consort Jen would sit in her freezing, boarded-up pavilion at Jingqi for 3 full years. She would stare at the nailed doors, absorb the silence, and refuse to lose her mind. She was an anomaly the imperial algorithm simply could not process. Born in 1876, the woman known to history as the Pearl Consort was never meant to be a compliant variable in the Ne Wufu's meticulously balanced ledgers. When she entered the Forbidden City, she brought an alien concept into a medieval ecosystem. She carried an explosive charge disguised as curiosity. She ignored the unwritten rules of harem economics, refusing to spend her silver allowance on bribes for premium charcoal or the favors of the kitchen staff. Instead, she bought a massive, cumbersome Western camera, turning her inner court quarters into a makeshift photography studio. She developed her own glass plates, capturing the unvarnished reality of the palace, rather than relying on stylized court painters. She dressed in men's official clothing to entertain Emperor Guangxu, deliberately blurring the rigid gender segregation that formed the bedrock of palace discipline. She crossed the ultimate red line of the Qing Dynasty by treating the emperor not as a terrifying master to be manipulated, but as a political partner. Guangxu was a young, heavily constrained ruler, desperately trying to push a decaying empire into the 20th century. He found his sounding board in a teenager. She discussed state policy with him, openly supporting the radical modernization efforts that would later be known as the 100 Days Reform. This made her a massive vulnerability. To Empress Dowager Cixi, the supreme architect of the inner court's strict hierarchy, Zhenfei was a contagion. A woman's power was supposed to begin and end with the emperor's fleeting romantic attention. A woman with an ideological agenda was a threat to the state itself. The 3-year sentence to the Jingqi Pavilion served as a brutal political quarantine. The system failed. The late Qing inner court was a machine perfectly calibrated to convert ordinary palace spaces into instruments of silent removal. You sealed the room, you wait a few seasons, and eventually a unit quietly carts out a corpse ruined by tuberculosis, starvation, or madness. The records remain clean. The violence remains invisible. But Zhenfei held on. She survived the brutal conditions of her confinement. She maintained her sanity by sheer defiant force of will, refusing to let the darkness dissolve her identity. The administration had deployed its most foolproof weapon against a 22-year-old girl, and the weapon broke against her resolve. Then, the world outside the 8-meter walls collapsed. By August 1900, the Boxer Rebellion had torn northern China apart. The 8-nation alliance breached the gates of Beijing. Artillery fire shook the heavy, yellow-tiled roofs of the inner sanctum, and thick black smoke rose over the Tartar city. The timeless schedule of the Forbidden City shattered overnight. The imperial machine, which usually operated with glacial precision, was thrown into a state of scrambling panic. High-ranking eunuchs were stripping off their embroidered silk robes and frantically changing into stolen peasant clothing. The treasury was being hastily packed into unmarked wooden carts. Empress Dowager Cixi cut her famously long fingernails, dressed herself as a rural farm woman, and prepared to flee the capital under the cover of chaos. Amidst the evacuation, the court faced a critical logistical crisis regarding the prisoner locked in the northeastern quadrant. They could not take a high-ranking political offender on a grueling undercover flight across hostile territory. They also could not leave a charismatic, reform-minded favorite of the emperor behind. If foreign troops found her alive, she could be used as a legitimate royal figurehead to negotiate a new government, entirely bypassing Cixi's authority. Looking at the fragmented historical materials and conflicting oral histories of that morning, I find a deliberate fog surrounding the exact administrative justification used for what came next. Some later popular accounts claim Suchi issued a formal decree of execution, a desperate attempt to assert total control over her household while losing control of the country. Other historians suggest the court framed the order as a matter of preserving strict palace discipline, a twisted logic dictating that a higher-ranking consort must commit suicide to protect her honor from the invading armies. The paperwork didn't matter anymore. The elaborate mask of civilized erasure was slipping off the face of the dynasty. Sushi ordered the heavy wooden planks of the Jingqi pavilion pried open. Jinfei was dragged out into the blinding August sunlight. She had not seen the sky in over 1,000 days. She was emaciated, her silk robes rotting off her frame, her body severely weakened by years of malnutrition and untreated illness. Yet the oral traditions that survive the fall of the empire insist she did not crawl out as a submissive victim. She stood upright. When presented with the imperial order to drown herself, she outright refused. She demanded a formal royal audience with Emperor Guangxu, who was reportedly standing nearby, entirely powerless to intervene. She challenged the authority of the Empress Dowager to her face, a breach of fundamental court etiquette so profound it paralyzed the observing staff. The bureaucratic method had finally exhausted its options. The cold couldn't break her. There was no more time for the slow, clean violence of the Cold Palace Protocol. The empire had to resort to something deeply uncharacteristic of its ritualized facade. An unscripted, messy, hands-on homicide. Eunuch Cui Yugui received the final, unspoken nod. He grabbed the pearl consort. The struggle was not a dignified ceremonial end. It was a brutal physical fight between a starved young woman and a terrified palace servant acting on the immediate orders of a fleeing sovereign. He dragged her away from the main thoroughfares, pulling her violently toward the northern tip of the treasure gallery in the Palace of Tranquil Longevity. They reached a small, obscure courtyard. In the corner sat a utilitarian well, designed purely for drawing groundwater to wash the paving stones or fight localized fires. Its opening was incredibly narrow, a tight stone cylinder barely wide enough to accommodate a human body. The exact circumstances of her final moments remain, as noted, a subject of conflicting legends. What is undisputed is the violent splash that broke the morning silence. A heavy stone cover was rolled over the opening. The imperial court fled the city just hours later, leaving her body at the bottom of the shaft. Today, if you walk through the Palace of Tranquil Longevity, you will eventually find a dense crowd of tourists pressed against a velvet rope. They are looking down at the Zhenfei Jing, the well of consort pearl. It is an entirely underwhelming physical object. The stone opening is tiny, heavily modified with iron bars in later years to prevent accidents. It has long been dry, preserved simply as a protected cultural relic. It looks like a minor, forgotten piece of plumbing infrastructure. Yet, it is one of the most intensely visited, heavily photographed sites in the entire 180-acre complex.